They said Gideon Mercer was the kind of man you built a wall with, not the kind you built a life around. Quiet, deliberate. The sort who showed up before dawn and left after dark without ever needing to be asked twice. Edwin Ashcroft had employed 300 men across his Montana timber holdings, and not one of them worked like Gideon worked, like the axe was the only honest thing left in the world. But nobody knew what was waiting at the end of that man's silence. Nobody knew what he was protecting. And on the morning of October 14th, 1884, when a boy on a lathered horse rode into the timber camp screaming Gideon's name into the rain, everything buried inside that quiet man came tearing to the surface, and the hills of Montana would never look at him the same way again. The storm had been building since before first light. Gideon felt it before he saw it. That particular drop in air pressure that pressed against the back of his skull like a thumb, the way the pine needles went still and then moved all wrong, sideways instead of down, as if the wind couldn't decide which direction it wanted to tear things apart from. He'd been in these mountains long enough to read that kind of weather the way other men read a contract. It meant flooding in the lower draws. It meant the timber roads would turn to clay by afternoon. It meant any man still out on the ridgeline when the real fury hit would have a serious conversation with his own mortality. He swung the axe anyway. The spruce he was working was a big one, 80 feet of Montana timber that had been growing since before the war, its bark thick and furrowed as old scar tissue. Every other man in his crew had their eyes on the sky, watching the green-black mass of clouds rolling in from the northwest with the particular patience of something that had already decided your fate. Gideon kept his eyes on the wood. The axe came down in measured, two-handed arcs, each stroke biting a clean wedge from the notch he'd started at first light, each stroke the same as the one before it, controlled, economical, nothing wasted. Terrence Webb, his crew partner, was watching him from across the cut with the expression men reserve for things they can't quite explain. "Storm's coming hard," Terrence said. He was a big man from Ohio who'd come west after the railroads laid him off, and he had the blunt declarative speech of someone who had learned that most things worth saying could be said in under 10 words. "Foreman's talking about pulling the crew back to the lower camp." "I heard him." Gideon didn't stop the axe. "You ain't going?" "I will when this tree comes down." Terrence squinted at the notch, then at the sky, running some private calculation. "Gideon, that tree's still got 40 minutes of work in it." "Then I've got 40 minutes of work in me." Terrence blew air through his teeth and said nothing else, which was the thing Gideon had always appreciated about the man. He understood that some conversations were closed before they started. The other men filtered off the ridge in ones and twos, their voices carrying back through the trees, complaints about the pay, about the foreman's timber quotas, about the state of the camp food. Normal grievances. The soft, habitual grumbling of men who hadn't yet learned that complaining about conditions was a luxury reserved for people whose problems were small enough to talk about out loud. Gideon had stopped talking about his problems the year his son was born. He'd started working harder instead, and somewhere in that transition he'd lost the particular social muscle required to explain himself to other people. The ridge emptied. He kept working. The first real gust hit when the spruce was 3/4 down, a wall of cold air that drove horizontally through the timber stand and sent a shudder through every tree on the slope. Gideon set his feet wider and kept the axe moving. The notch was deep now, the white interior wood exposed and bright against the weathered bark, and he could hear the deep internal creaking that meant the tree had begun to commit to its fall. Another 20 minutes, maybe 15 if he pushed. He pushed. The rain arrived without preamble. Not a gradual build, but a sudden, total presence, as if the sky had been holding it back with both hands and simply let go. Within seconds, his shirt was soaked through, the wool plastered against his shoulders, and the sawdust from the cut turned to paste on his forearms. He registered all of it the way he registered everything that didn't directly threaten the work, as background noise, as the price of being here, as just another thing that had to be endured before the tree came down and he could bank another day's wage against the debt that had been following his family like a shadow for 3 years running. The debt. He didn't let himself think about it directly, the way you didn't look directly at certain things if you wanted to keep your hands steady. He kept it in his peripheral awareness, always present, always pressing, a number that had grown from something manageable into something that seemed to breathe on its own, to expand in the dark when he wasn't watching it. $47.30. The figure was branded into the inside of his skull. He could have recited it in his sleep and probably had. Thomas Caldwell. He didn't think of the man as a creditor. He thought of him as a system, as a machine dressed in a man's coat. Had been patient for 2 years, the kind of patience that isn't generosity but strategy, that lets interest compound and leverage accumulate until the moment patience becomes more profitable than payment. That moment, Gideon suspected, was getting close. He felt the tree begin its final lean, a slow, massive tipping that every timberman knew, the way sailors knew a wave, in the body before the mind. And he stepped back and called out of pure habit to the empty ridge, "Timber!" His voice swallowed immediately by the wind and rain, the great spruce coming down through its neighbors with a sound like consecutive cannon fire, branches shattering, the trunk hitting the slope with a concussive impact he felt in his boots. He stood in the rain looking at what he'd done. Then he heard the horse honk. It came up through the lower trail at a speed that was wrong for the weather, wrong for the grade, wrong for anything except emergency. Gideon heard the hooves before he saw the animal. That particular panicked rhythm, all 4 legs driving past each other with no economy. And he turned from the fallen tree with the axe still in his hand and watched a gray horse come lunging out of the tree line with a boy on its back who looked like he'd been riding hard for more than an hour. The boy's name was Danny Pratt. He was 11 years old, the son of the woman who washed and mended for the lower camp, and Gideon knew him as a reliable, serious child who didn't run unless he had a reason to run. He had a reason. "Mr. Mercer." The boy pulled the horse up hard, the animal blowing and trembling, its coat dark with rain and sweat. "Mr. Mercer, you gotta come. Clara sent me. She said—" The boy's breath was broken up by the hard ride, coming in pieces. "She said to tell you they came this morning. 3 of them. She said they got papers." Gideon's hand tightened on the axe handle. "Caldwell's men." "Yes, sir." The boy looked at him with the careful, watchful expression children develop when they've been around adult trouble long enough to understand its shape. "They got the wagon. They were measuring things when I left. The furniture and the—" She said they were measuring the furniture. "Your boy was crying, she said to tell you that. She tried to keep him inside." The sound of the rain seemed to change register, as if it had gotten louder, though he didn't think that was actually true. He was aware of the axe in his hand. He was aware of the slope beneath his boots, the downed spruce beside him, the gray sky pressing down on the ridge. He was aware of the number $47.30 rotating through his skull with a new and terrible meaning. "How long ago?" he said. 2 hours, maybe." "I rode hard as I could, Mr. Mercer, but the lower ford is flooding bad. I had to find the high crossing." "You did right." He looked at the boy. "You ride back to camp, tell Foreman Hutchings that Gideon Mercer left the ridge on account of a family emergency. Tell him exactly that." "What about—" "Tell him exactly that." He was already moving toward the timber road. "Go now, Danny. Get out of the rain." The boy went. Gideon went the other direction. Sad. What followed was not a run in any conventional sense. It was something more systematic than that, and more terrible. He had 7 miles between the ridge camp and his cabin, 7 miles of mountain terrain in a storm that was still building toward its real violence, and he moved through it with the same deliberate economy he brought to the axe. No wasted motion, no panic eating his oxygen, just forward momentum translated as efficiently as possible across ground that was actively working against him. He knew this land. That was the only advantage he had. The timber road went south and then cut west, which added 1.5 miles to the distance but kept the terrain passable. He took it at a pace that would have broken most men in 15 minutes and kept that pace for 40, his boots finding purchase in the mud by feel and memory, the rain hitting him from the side now as the wind shifted, sheets of it that reduced visibility to 20 feet and turned the road ahead into a brown, churning channel. He didn't curse the weather. He didn't think about the weather. The weather was what it was. And what it was had nothing to do with whether his wife and son were standing in their home watching strangers catalog their belongings. His wife's name was Clara. He didn't think of her the way poets thought of women. He wasn't built for that kind of thinking and probably never had been. But he thought of her the way he thought of everything he'd decided to protect, with a steady, animal certainty that the alternative was unacceptable. She had come west with him from Illinois 6 years ago on the strength of a promise he'd made about a piece of ground in Montana, a promise that had been honest when he made it and had stayed honest even as everything around it went wrong. She hadn't complained once. Not once in 6 years. Not when the land didn't produce what he'd hoped. Not when the lumber work ate his hands and kept him away for weeks at a stretch. Not even when Caldwell's interest had mounted past anything they could realistically repay. She had $3 in a tin box under the floorboard. He knew this because he'd counted it with her. $3.40, which, together with his wages due at end of month, brought them to somewhere around $11 total against a debt that was now $47 and climbing. He ran. Baratin. The place where the timber road met the river crossing was, under ordinary conditions, a manageable ford. Knee-deep, rocky bottom, the kind of crossing you could take a loaded wagon through if you chose your line right. He arrived at it 40 minutes into the run and stopped at the bank. The ford was gone. In its place was 8 feet of brown, fast-moving water that carried with it sections of cut timber, entire uprooted bushes, and the various debris of everything the storm was tearing loose upstream. The far bank, which on a normal day he could see clearly, was visible only as a darker mass through the driving rain. The current had that particular flat, muscular quality of water that had made up its mind about where it was going. He stood there for exactly the time it took him to assess it. Then he went in. The cold hit him like a deliberate act of violence. Not just cold, but a kind of cold that reached into the deeper structures of the body and grabbed hold of things. He felt his breath seize in his chest, felt his muscles lock up in protest, felt the current grab his legs and attempt to reintroduce him to the river's intentions. He put his shoulder into it, found the bottom with his boots, irregular, shifting, one rock and then another, and moved across with the axe held high and his body angled upstream, using the current's force rather than fighting it directly. Halfway across, he went under. A submerged log, invisible in the murk, caught him at the knees and flipped him forward, and for 3 or 4 seconds he was entirely in the river's custody. Turning, the cold so total it was almost beyond sensation, the dark water above and around him without seam or direction. He got one hand on a rock. He pulled. The current worked on him with patient, enormous force, and he worked against it with something that was past ordinary strength, because ordinary strength had a limit, and what was happening inside him at that moment didn't. He came up on the far bank coughing river water, on his hands and knees in the mud, the axe somehow still in his grip. He got up. He kept moving. Trust. His lungs had mostly normalized by the time he hit the second tree line, though his clothes were dead weight against his skin and his boots were full of river. He'd lost some time at the crossings, 15 minutes, maybe 20, and he was running the math in his head with the part of his mind that stayed cold no matter what, the part that had learned to keep calculating even when the rest of him was screaming. 2 hours since Danny left, an hour and a half transit for the boy. So Caldwell's men had been at the cabin for close to 4 hours now. 4 hours was long enough to inventory everything worth taking, long enough to get his wife to sign documents she probably didn't understand, her schooling having stopped at the age of 12 when her own father put her to work, long enough for 3 men to make a woman believe she had no options. He was running through the second tree line when he heard voices ahead on the trail. Not his destination, not the cabin, just voices where there shouldn't be voices in this weather. And he slowed instinctively, dropping back to the tree line, his breathing controlled by force of will. 2 men on horseback, working their way up the same trail he was using, moving slowly because the horses were nervous in the storm. They were heading toward the high road, away from his cabin, and in the failing light and driving rain they were just shapes. Heavy coats, wide-brimmed hats plastered down by the water. He couldn't make out their faces. But then the first horse shied at something in the trail, and the rider cursed and yanked the reins. And in yanking, the man's coat fell open. And Gideon saw the rifle scabbard strapped to the saddle, not a hunting rifle. A military pattern repeater with a short barrel and a tarnished action that had seen considerable use. That wasn't a timberman. That wasn't a rancher moving stock ahead of the storm. He stayed motionless in the tree line and watched them pass. And what he felt was not fear exactly, but a recalibration. A quiet, internal shifting of assumptions about what he was going to find when he reached the cabin. 3 men, Danny had said. 3 men with papers. But papers and rifle scabbards were different animals. Papers were a legal threat, which meant there were courts and procedures and responses. Rifles were a physical threat, which meant there was only the moment in front of you and what you chose to do inside it. He waited until the horses were well past. Then he left the trail entirely and went through the trees, parallel to the path, moving faster now that he didn't need to worry about the noise. The first sign of the cabin was the lamplight. It came through the trees as a yellow smear in the gray, dark afternoon, and he stopped 30 yards out and crouched behind a deadfall, water streaming from his hair and beard, and looked. 3 horses at the hitch post outside. The horses were under the partial shelter of the lean-to he'd built along the cabin's east wall, which meant whoever these men were, they'd been here long enough to stable their animals, long enough to make themselves comfortable. A 4th horse was missing, a 5th, actually, if you counted the one Clara sometimes borrowed from Hennessy down the road, which told him nothing useful about numbers but confirmed this wasn't a quick visit. The cabin door was closed, lamplight and 2 windows. He moved through the trees to the north side where the wood storage was, keeping low, keeping quiet, and came up alongside the cabin wall with his back pressed against the planking he'd cut and fitted himself 3 years ago, every board remembered in his hands. He could hear voices inside. More than one. He couldn't make out words yet, just the cadence. 2 or 3 voices, one of them much louder than the others, with the particular rhythm of a man who was used to being the loudest person in any room and had stopped noticing whether it was useful or necessary. He moved to the window on the north side. Clara's window, the one she'd insisted on having face the pine stand because she said she liked waking up to trees, and looked in through the gap at the shutter's edge. The first thing he saw was his son. Thomas was 5 years old, and he was sitting in the corner by the woodbox with his knees pulled to his chest and his face pointed at the floor, and he was doing the thing he did when he was very frightened. The silent thing, the still thing, because he had learned early that when adults were angry at each other, the best option was to become as invisible as possible. Clara had taught him that, not intentionally, but through the 10,000 small demonstrations of a woman who'd learned the same lesson herself, and passed it down the only way you could, through example. The sight of his son sitting in that corner did something specific to the inside of Gideon's chest. Not rage. Rage was hot, and it made you fast and stupid, and that wasn't the thing he needed. What he felt was colder than rage, slower, more deliberate, the kind of thing that doesn't have a name, but that men who've been in serious trouble recognize as the state that precedes complete commitment. He looked at the men. 3 of them. One standing by the table where Clara was seated, a heavy-set man in a black coat with a stack of documents in his hand, and the practiced, performative patience of someone who collected debts for a living and had learned to use stillness as a pressure. He was the one Gideon had heard through the wall, the loud one, though he was quiet now, which was somehow worse. The second man was younger, leaning against the far wall near the fireplace with his arms crossed, watching Clara with the kind of blank, assessing attention that made Gideon want to put the axe through the wall. The third was near the door, and Gideon couldn't see him well enough to read him, just a shape and the glint of something metal that might have been a buckle or might have been something else. Clara was sitting very straight. He knew that posture, had seen it 1,000 times, and knew what it cost her, that precise, controlled uprightness in the face of something she couldn't fight with her body, the posture of a woman maintaining dignity through pure force of spine because it was the only territory left to her. She had her hands flat on the table and she was looking at the man with the documents with an expression Gideon recognized as controlled fear, wearing the mask of composure. He looked at the documents. Even from outside the window, in the bad light and the rain, he could see what they were. Or rather, he could see what they were trying to look like. Official documents had a particular appearance, a layout and formality that communicated authority through form as much as content. These had something of that appearance, but the paper was wrong. Too white, too fresh for anything that had been through proper legal channels, and the seals were positioned in the wrong place on the page. He'd seen enough legitimate contracts in his time to know when something was performing legitimacy rather than possessing it. The man with the documents leaned forward and placed one of them in front of Clara, and she looked at it, and Gideon watched her face and saw the moment she couldn't tell if it was real or not, the moment the uncertainty itself became the weapon. "You understand what this says," the man said. He had a voice with a Missouri flatness to it, the kind of voice that had learned to project confidence by projecting nothing at all. "The amount due as of October 1st. Your husband hasn't made a payment in 4 months. Mr. Caldwell has been more than patient, Mrs. Mercer." "My husband," Clara said, and her voice was steady in a way that made Gideon's throat tighten, "makes his payments to Mr. Caldwell directly. If there's a dispute about the account—" "There's no dispute." The man tapped the document. "This is the accounting. This is what's owed. What we need from you today is your signature acknowledging the balance and consenting to the temporary transfer of certain personal property as collateral against continued— I'm not signing anything until my husband has seen those papers." The man looked at her with an expression that was almost admiring, the way a machine might be almost admiring if machines could feel that. "Your husband," he said, "is 6 miles up a mountain in a storm that's going to close every road in this county by nightfall. Your husband isn't coming, Mrs. Mercer, and Mr. Caldwell's patience, as I said, his patience can wait until morning." Silence. The man straightened. He took the document back from the table and looked at it for a moment, as if performing consideration, and then he looked at the young man by the fireplace. Something passed between them. Gideon couldn't see it clearly, but he felt it, the way you feel a change in pressure. "Mrs. Mercer," the man said, and his voice had shifted, the flat Missouri calm replaced by something that had more edges. "I want to explain your situation to you as clearly as I can. We are here with legal authority to assess and document the contents of this property against an outstanding debt. If you obstruct that process, you haven't shown me anything that says you have authority to be inside my home. The document in front of you is a piece of paper with a seal on it." Claire's hands, Gideon noticed, had gone flat on the table, pressing down, the knuckles whitening slightly. "My husband knows the law. He has told me about the law. You cannot take our property without a court order, and a court order comes from a judge, and a judge's signature looks different from whatever that is." The room went very quiet. The young man by the fireplace unfolded his arms. Gideon stopped watching through the window and moved to the door. He didn't crash through it. That would have been satisfying in a way that would have been useless. 3 men in a closed space, one of them already moving toward an aggressive posture. And Gideon had lived long enough and worked rough enough country long enough to know that the man who came through a door like a battering ram was announcing everything about himself to people who now had the information and the initiative. He opened the door the way he opened it every night he came home from the timber camps. Steadily, without violence, as if he belonged there, which he did. The cold air and rain came in with him, and every head in the room turned. He stood in the doorway in his soaked clothes with the axe still in his right hand. He hadn't consciously decided to hold on to it. It had simply stayed. And he looked at the room. He looked at Clara first. She was unhurt, physically, and the expression on her face when she saw him did something to his chest that he refused to examine in this moment, because this moment required everything that wasn't feeling. He looked at his son in the corner, who had lifted his head and was looking at him with the particular expression of a child who has decided that his father is a fixed point in a world that has been moving wrong, and Gideon held that look for exactly a second. Then he looked at the 3 men. The one with the documents, the Missouri voice, the black coat, had turned to face him with the careful steadiness of a man recalculating. The young man by the fireplace had taken a half step forward and then stopped. The 3rd man, the one near the door, was closest to Gideon, and Gideon could now see him clearly. Mid-30s, scar along his jaw, the kind of still that wasn't calm but suppressed energy, the still of someone who had decided something but hadn't yet moved. "Gideon Mercer," the man in the black coat said. "Not a question." "Get out of my house." The man looked at him, looked at the soaked clothes, the river mud, the axe, the expression, and made a decision. He made the decision that Gideon could read in the way his posture shifted, the way the document came back up in his hand like a shield or a weapon, or both. "Mr. Mercer, I understand this looks—" "Get out of my house." Gideon stepped inside. The door was still open behind him, rain and wind filling the space at his back. "Whatever you came here with, whatever you were told to do here, you're done doing it. My wife asked you to leave." I'm asking you to leave. You leave now. Sir, these documents represent a legal obligation. Put them on my table and I'll look at them tomorrow. Gideon moved into the room, not toward the man but toward his son, crossing to the woodbox and crouching down and putting his free hand on Thomas's shoulder. The boy was trembling, whether from fear or relief or both Gideon couldn't tell. And then he stood back up and turned to face the room with his son behind him. Right now, you three are trespassing in my home without a legal order authorizing it, which my wife has already told you, and she's right. So you can leave with whatever you came in with, or you can wait while I ride down to the county seat tomorrow and file a complaint with the circuit judge about 3 men who showed up at a woman's house while her husband was working and tried to coerce her signature on documents that don't appear to have been issued by any court I'm familiar with. The man in the black coat was very still. You're in no position to make threats, he said quietly. I'm not making threats. I'm stating options. Gideon held the man's gaze with the particular steadiness that comes not from confidence exactly, but from the complete absence of any alternative. There was nothing behind him worth losing. There was no version of this where he walked back out that door without his family intact. That was not a threat, and it was not a performance, and the man across the room could apparently read it, because his eyes went to the axe and then to Gideon's face, and then to the axe again. Mr. Caldwell will hear about this. Mr. Caldwell is welcome to write me a letter. The man in the black coat held for another 2 seconds. Long enough to preserve some face, Gideon supposed. Long enough to make the retreat look like choice rather than necessity. And then he nodded to the young man by the fireplace and the third man near the door, and they moved. Not quickly, not in fear, but with the controlled retreat of men who were recalculating rather than surrendering. Documents gathered, hats put back on. The third man passed within 3 feet of Gideon on his way to the door and looked at him with an expression Gideon catalogued carefully and filed away, because it wasn't anger and it wasn't defeat. It was patience. The door closed behind them. Gideon listened to the horses being unhitched in the rain, listened to the wet sound of hooves on mud going down the track, listened to the sound getting smaller and then being swallowed by the storm. He put the axe down against the wall. Clara was out of her chair before he could turn around, and she had both arms around him with her face pressed against his soaked shoulder. And he stood there with his hands on her back and let himself hold her in the particular way of a man who has been running toward this moment for 3 hours through a flooded mountain and arrived to find it still intact, still real, still salvageable. "Thomas," he said over her shoulder. The boy was already across the room, his face pressed against Gideon's leg, both small arms wrapped around as much of him as they could reach. For a moment, exactly a moment, the cabin was just the cabin. Rain on the roof, fire in the grate, his family in his hands. "The papers," Clara said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Gideon, the papers they had, I couldn't tell. I couldn't tell if they were real." They weren't. He said it with more certainty than he had, but certainty was what she needed right now, and he could examine the details later. They weren't real. She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were dry. Clara did not cry in front of Thomas if she could help it, another thing she had learned through long demonstration. But her face was open in a way it almost never was. The composure she maintained all day, every day, slightly stripped by what the last 4 hours had put her through. "They'll come back," she said. "I know. With more than papers next time." He looked at her. He didn't answer right away because there wasn't an answer that was both honest and reassuring, and he'd learned a long time ago that false reassurance was a debt of its own, paid later with interest, and Clara deserved better than that. "I know," he said again. What he didn't say, what he was still processing, standing in his dripping clothes in the warmth of his own home, was what he'd seen in the third man's face as he passed. Not anger, not defeat. Patience. The same kind of patience Caldwell had been using for 2 years. The kind of patience that let you wait until conditions improved. The kind of patience that as the storm outside reached its full howling violence and the road down to the county seat became impassable mud, and every route between this cabin and any help that might exist closed off one by one in the dark, was just another word for certainty. He didn't know, standing there in the firelight with his family intact and the collectors gone and the storm walling him in on all sides, that a man had followed him through the mountains that afternoon, that a man on a gray horse had watched him cross the flooded ford, had watched him move through the tree line parallel to the trail, had been watching, carefully, quietly, with an attention that was both clinical and unexpectedly personal, from the moment he'd left the fallen spruce on the ridge. He didn't know that Edwin Ashcroft was sitting in the timber camp's lower house right now, soaked to the skin himself, with an expression on his face that 300 men in his employ had never once seen. He didn't know that what had begun as suspicion had become, over 7 miles of storm and mountain and flooded river, something Ashcroft didn't have a ready word for. He didn't know any of it. What he knew was that the third man's eyes had said, "Not today," which meant tomorrow. Which meant tomorrow or the day after or the night after that, when the storm had passed and the roads were open again, and 3 men who now knew the exact inventory of his home and the exact vulnerability of his wife could return with whatever tools patience had prepared for them in the intervening hours. He crossed to the window and looked out at the darkness. The storm was at its worst now, the kind of darkness that isn't just the absence of light, but the presence of everything the light had been keeping back. The trees bent, the rain moved sideways. The road to town was already gone under 6 inches of water, and there was nothing, no circuit judge, no sheriff, no law or system or institution that could move through what was moving outside that window. Just his family, just the cabin, just the night, pressing in. And somewhere out there in it, coming back or waiting or both, the patient machinery of a debt that had never intended to be paid. He turned from the window. His son was asleep in the chair by the fire, exhausted by terror into the profound unconsciousness of childhood. Clara was at the table, one hand resting on the documents the collectors had left behind. Had they left them intentionally, as pressure, as reminder? He hadn't decided yet. Her eyes on Gideon with an expression that held every question she wasn't asking in front of the sleeping boy. He crossed to the table. He sat down across from her. He picked up the top document and read it, slowly, in the firelight, and the longer he read, the slower his breathing became. Not from calm, but from the effort of maintaining calm, the effort of keeping his face neutral while the words on the paper rearranged everything he thought he understood about the situation. This wasn't a debt collection. The language was wrong. The provisions were wrong. The signature line wasn't for Clara to acknowledge the debt. It was for Clara to transfer the deed. The entire debt narrative, 2 years of payments, of patience, of Caldwell's generosity, had been a mechanism, a machine for creating conditions. Conditions where a man with a mortgage note and a willing collector and 3 men with patient eyes could walk into a remote cabin on a stormy afternoon and walk out with land that, Gideon realized with a cold precision that felt like standing in the river again, was worth more than the debt had ever been. Much more. He set the paper down. He looked at Clara. She was watching him read her face, looking for the thing his face would tell her that his words might not, the thing wives learn to read in husbands who don't talk about their troubles out loud. She found it. "How bad?" she said. He was about to answer. Then, outside in the howling dark, through the storm, through the rain, through the screaming wind that had been drowning out everything else for the past hour, he heard a sound. A horse. Not leaving. Arriving. The horse came out of the dark like something the storm had made. Gideon was already on his feet when the knock came. Not a polite knock, not the measured administrative rapping of a man who believed he had authority, but 3 solid impacts that communicated urgency without panic, the knock of someone who needed to be heard and had already decided they would be. Thomas didn't stir in his chair by the fire. Clara's hand came off the documents and dropped to her lap. Gideon crossed to the wall where the axe was leaning and stood with one hand resting on the handle, not lifting it, not yet, just keeping the option available, and looked at his wife. She gave him a single nod. She'd heard the horse too, and she'd already made the same calculation he had. 1 rider, not 3, and the knock had no theater in it. He opened the door. The man on the porch was soaked through in a way that took time, the kind of soaking that meant hours in the open rather than minutes, water running off the brim of his hat in an unbroken stream, his coat gone dark and heavy with it. He was taller than Gideon by 2 inches and broader in the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had since been rearranged by weather and decision into something more interesting. He was somewhere past 50, with the particular physical authority of a man who had never in his life needed to make himself larger because he'd never stopped being large. His eyes, even in the bad light, were the color of river ice in February. Not cold exactly, but very clear, very still, the eyes of someone who had learned to look at things without letting the looking show on his face. Edwin Ashcroft looked at Gideon Mercer. Gideon looked back at him. "Mercer," Ashcroft said. "Mr. Ashcroft." Neither of them moved. The storm pushed between them, rain lashing the porch planks, a gust taking the door and pulling it hard against Gideon's grip. "You're going to want to let me in," Ashcroft said. "I'm going to want to know why you're here first." Something shifted in Ashcroft's face, not irritation, not quite, but the particular adjustment of a man who was accustomed to doors opening before he reached them, recalibrating for a door that wasn't going to do that. He looked at Gideon for another beat, and then he reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, with the careful movement of someone who understood what it looked like to reach inside a coat in front of a man with his hand on an axe, and produced a folded piece of paper. "Because," Ashcroft said, holding it out, "I've seen those documents before." The fire had been built up, and Ashcroft's coat was hanging by the door, and Clara had put coffee on without being asked, because Clara understood hospitality as a form of intelligence gathering in a way that Gideon had always admired and never fully understood. Ashcroft sat at the table across from Gideon with his hands wrapped around a tin cup, and Thomas was still asleep in the chair, and the storm did what it wanted outside while the three of them occupied the small, lamplit silence of people deciding how much to trust each other. Ashcroft had unfolded his paper on the table. It was a legal document, genuinely legal. Gideon could see the difference now that he had a real one for comparison. With a circuit court seal in the correct position and a judge's signature that had the particular messiness of actual handwriting rather than the careful performed penmanship of a forgery trying to look official. "Caldwell used the same structure on Hennessy's property 2 years ago," Ashcroft said. "South quarter section, down by the creek bend. You know it?" "I know Hennessy." "Hennessy doesn't own that quarter section anymore." Ashcroft looked at the document. 2 years ago, 3 men showed up at his place with papers. His wife was home alone. He was working the high pasture. By the time he got back, she'd signed. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that." "Nobody does. That's how it works." Ashcroft turned the document around and pushed it across the table. "Caldwell's been doing this for 4 years. Small parcels, isolated properties, men who work away from home. He buys the debt. Sometimes he manufactures it, and then he engineers a moment. A storm. A man 6 miles from home. A woman alone with children and a piece of paper she can't quite read." Gideon looked at the document without touching it. "What's he want with my land?" "Your land sits between his north holding and the Blackwater Creek drainage. He needs that corridor to run a road to the new timber contracts up on the divide." Ashcroft picked up his coffee. "Your 40 acres is the only parcel he doesn't control. Has been for 2 years. The fire popped. Clara was standing near the stove with her arms crossed, listening. She had the expression she wore when she was processing information that she'd already partially suspected and was now having confirmed. The expression of a woman whose intuitions had been right and who took no pleasure in the confirmation. "You followed me," Gideon said. "I did. From the ridge." "From the ridge." Gideon let that sit. He looked at Ashcroft with the steady, patient attention he gave to things that required understanding before they required response, the axe-work principle applied to human beings, and Ashcroft held the look without deflecting it, which told him something. A man with something to hide looked away first. A man who was managing you kept his eyes moving. Ashcroft just looked back, still and clear, waiting. "Why?" Gideon said. "Because I saw you leave the ridge in that storm, and I wanted to know where you were going." "That's not an answer." "No." Ashcroft set down the cup. "I followed you because I've had 3 men quit this month, and 2 of them mentioned Caldwell's name when they left. And I've been watching that man's operations for 6 months trying to understand the full shape of what he's doing. When the Pratt boy came up to the ridge and I watched your face," he paused, something crossing behind his eyes that wasn't quite sentiment, but was in that neighborhood. I wanted to understand what kind of man I'd been employing for 3 years without actually knowing. And I watched you cross the Blackwater Ford at full flood. I watched you pull yourself out on the far bank and get up and keep running. A pause. I watched you stop on the high trail when those 2 riders came past. The ones who'd been watching your cabin since this morning, Mercer, not 3 men but 5, and make a decision about them in about 3 seconds without making a sound. The room had gone very still. Clara's arms had come uncrossed, and she was looking at her husband with an expression he'd never seen on her before, which meant there were still new expressions in her after 6 years, which in another moment he might have thought about differently. 5, he said. 2 were watching the approaches. They were the insurance in case you came back before the papers got signed. Gideon sat with that for a moment, feeling the shape of it, feeling the full architecture of what had been planned and how close it had come to working. If the Blackwater Ford had been 2 feet higher, if he'd been another 20 minutes on the ridge. The 2 on the approach trail, he said, they're still out there. They were heading toward the high road when I came through. Storm pushed them off. Ashcroft looked at the window, at the darkness beyond. They'll be back when it clears, which is tomorrow morning. Earliest. Gideon stood up from the table. He didn't go anywhere. There was nowhere to go in a 1-room cabin. He just needed to be vertical, needed to feel the floor under his feet while he worked through what had to come next. He put his hands on the back of the chair and looked at the documents the collectors had left, and then at Ashcroft's genuine legal paper, and then at his son asleep in the firelight, and he felt the full weight of the position he was in. The way you feel a physical load, in the back, in the legs, in the place behind the sternum that was the last thing to admit it was tired. "What do you want, Mr. Ashcroft?" he said. Not hostile, just direct, the way he was direct about everything when there wasn't time for anything else. Ashcroft looked up at him. "I want to know if you'll let me help you." "Why?" "Because what Caldwell is doing crosses lines I don't intend to let get crossed on land adjacent to my holdings." "That's a business reason." "It is. You got personal ones, too." Ashcroft was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands around the cup, then back up at Gideon with the expression of a man deciding how honest to be, running the calculation that everyone ran, how much truth is useful, how much is exposure, and landing apparently on more than Gideon expected. "I had a foreman," Ashcroft said, 12 years ago. Good man. Best I ever employed, which is a thing I knew and didn't do enough about. Caldwell's predecessor, different name, same operation, used his wife's signature to take their land while I was sitting in my office in Helena looking at ledgers." He paused. "I didn't know what was happening on my own land, Mercer, because I wasn't paying attention to the right things. That foreman and his family were gone before I understood what I'd failed to see. I've had 12 years to think about what I should have done differently." The fire settled. The storm pressed against the walls. Gideon looked at this man, this wealthy, powerful, river ice-eyed man sitting at his table in his soaked coat, and felt the particular difficulty of receiving help from someone you'd spent 3 years making sure you didn't need help from. It wasn't pride exactly. It was the survival logic of a man who'd learned that owing people things was just debt by another name, that gratitude had its own compound interest, that every hand extended in assistance had a grip at the end of it. But there were 2 men on the high trail, and tomorrow morning the storm would clear. "What kind of help?" he said. They talked for an hour. Clara brought more coffee and sat down at the table, which in the context of Gideon's household meant she had decided this conversation required her direct participation rather than her peripheral monitoring, and Ashcroft, to his credit, Gideon noted, addressed himself to her as readily as to him, which was not something most men of Ashcroft's position did with women at working men's tables. The shape of it was this. Ashcroft had a relationship with the circuit judge in Billings, not a corrupt relationship, just the long familiarity of 2 men who had been in the territory since before it had courts worth the name, and he had, over the past 6 months, been quietly assembling evidence of Caldwell's land operations. The documents on the table were part of a pattern he could demonstrate. The signatures obtained from Hennessy's wife and 2 other women in similar circumstances were obtained under fraud and duress, which under Montana territorial law constituted grounds for nullification. But nullification required a filing. A filing required presence in Billings, and Billings was 70 miles away with every road between here and there turning to soup under the current storm. He knows that, Clara said. She was looking at the collector's documents, her hand resting on the table a few inches from the paper. That's why they came today. Yes, Ashcroft said. They needed the signature before the roads opened, before anyone could ride to town. She looked up. They'll come back tomorrow because tomorrow is their last window before you could reach Billings. That's my read. Gideon had been listening to this exchange and following the logic and feeling it converge on a single point. So the answer is to get to Billings first. Before the roads clear, yes. I have a man who knows a high route that stays passable in most conditions. It adds time, but avoids the flooded valley roads. If we leave before first light, Gideon said, you and I. Ashcroft held his gaze. Together, with my documentation and your testimony about what happened here today, we have enough for an emergency injunction. That stops any transfer of title until the fraud case is heard. It also, and this is the part that matters beyond your situation, it puts Caldwell's entire acquisition pattern on public record. You've been building toward that for 6 months, and you need my testimony to make it complete. I need your testimony to make it real. Ashcroft looked at him with the directness of a man who had decided against managing the conversation and toward finishing it. What I have is documentary. What you have is what happened in this room tonight. There's a difference in court between papers and a man who stood in a doorway with river water in his boots and watched 3 men threaten his family. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the fire, at his son, at his wife's face across the table. He looked at the documents and thought about the third man's patient eyes. He thought about $47.30 and the 2 years of patience that had been, as Ashcroft's accounting made clear, simply a mechanism for arriving at tonight. He thought about a foreman 12 years gone while a man in Helena looked at ledgers. There was a thing that happened inside him in this moment that didn't have a clean name. It wasn't gratitude and it wasn't trust. Not yet. It was something more like the moment when you've been carrying a load alone long enough that you've reorganized your entire body around the weight of it, and then someone offers to take the other end. And the question isn't whether you want help. The question is whether you can remember how to walk without the weight distributed wrong. Clara said, he said. She was already looking at him. She had been looking at him for the last several minutes with the expression he knew as her decision-making face, not uncertainty, not fear, but the focused, unsentimental assessment of a woman who had learned that clear-eyed thinking in hard moments was the only protection that never ran out. Go, she said. If they come back before, I know how to use the rifle. Her eyes didn't waver. I know how to lock a door. I know how to keep Thomas quiet. She paused. What I don't know how to do is fight $47 in a courtroom, and neither do you, and he does. A nod toward Ashcroft, not warm, not cold, just accurate. Go. Gideon stood there in the firelight of his own home, looking at his wife, and felt the specific, almost unbearable clarity of a man who has arranged his entire life around protecting something and has just been told by the thing he's protecting to let someone else stand beside him. He turned to Ashcroft. Before first light, he said, 2 hours. I need to sleep an hour. 1 hour. Then we ride. None. Ashcroft went to see to the horses, stepping back into the storm with the pragmatic ease of a man to whom weather was a condition rather than an event. Clara banked the fire and checked the rifle, working through the familiar routine with the economical attention she brought to things that mattered, loading, checking the action, positioning it within reach of the bed but out of Thomas's sight. Gideon sat for a moment in the chair his son had vacated, looking at the documents on the table. He picked up the collector's papers. He read them again, this time without the shock of the first reading, just cold attention applied to language that had been designed to mislead. The structure was almost elegant, an acknowledgement of debt layered over a consent to property transfer, layered over a forfeiture clause buried in the third paragraph that would have activated the moment Clara's signature was dry. 3 documents that looked like one conversation, with the weight-bearing provision hidden in the least readable section. Someone had spent real time on this. He thought about Caldwell, not the men Caldwell sent, but Caldwell himself, The mind that had assembled this mechanism over 4 years, buying debts, identifying parcels, engineering moments of isolation and vulnerability. He'd never met the man. He knew him only as a number and a system, the way you knew weather by its effects rather than its cause. But sitting in the firelight with the papers in his hands, he felt the shape of that mind the way you felt the shape of a river by the way it moved around an obstacle. Patient, comprehensive, interested in nothing except arriving at the end it had already identified. He'd been built for this, Gideon thought. Caldwell had been built for this the same way Gideon had been built for the axe. By the particular pressures and absences of a life that selected for one specific capacity and developed it past the point where other people could easily follow. The difference was that Caldwell's capacity operated in the dark. It required isolation, ignorance, women alone with documents they couldn't read. It required that the men it was aimed at stayed 6 miles away on a ridge while the machinery ran. He put the documents down. He looked at the window, at the dark and storm, at the 2 hours between now and the road to Billings and whatever came after. He felt the full weight of what had been in motion around him for 2 years without his knowledge. The patience of it, the scale of it, the systematic way it had waited for exactly tonight. And he felt for the first time in those 2 years something shift in the distribution of that weight. Not because Ashcroft had arrived, not because help had appeared. Because he'd crossed the river and come through the door, and the thing he'd been protecting was still here, still intact, and whatever was moving against him had committed itself now, had sent its men and shown its papers and revealed its shape, and a thing whose shape you knew was a different kind of enemy than a thing that lived in darkness and numbers. He'd been afraid of a debt. He understood now he'd been afraid of the wrong thing. He closed his eyes and slept. 1 hour. He woke without alarm, which he always did when he needed to. The internal clock that years of timber work had built operating without permission from the rest of him. The fire was down to coals. Clara was asleep in the bed with Thomas curved against her, the rifle within reach, her face in sleep, the face he'd fallen in love with a long time ago on a different piece of ground in a different life. All the controlled composure of her waking hours dissolved into something open and unreachable that he had never, in 6 years, felt he fully deserved. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled on his coat and his still damp boots and picked up the axe and went outside. Ashcroft was waiting by the horses. 2 of them saddled, the storm reduced to a hard, steady rain that had lost its violence but none of its persistence. He handed Gideon the reins of a horse he didn't recognize, a solid gray with a deep chest and the calm, experienced look of an animal that had been out in bad weather enough times to have developed opinions about it. "Good horse," Gideon said. "Better than the road we're taking," Ashcroft said. They rode out into the dark. For the first mile, neither of them spoke, the rain filling the silence between them, the horses finding their footing on the trail by whatever sense horses used for such things. The timber pressed in on both sides, the trees massive and black in the near darkness, the trail a slightly less dark channel between them. Gideon rode with his left hand loose on the rein and his right holding the axe across the saddle, not because he expected to use it, but because he'd been carrying it for 6 hours, and his hand had forgotten how not to. Ashcroft noticed. "You carried that across the Blackwater Ford," he said. "I did." A pause. "Why?" Gideon thought about it. The honest answer was that he hadn't made a decision about it, that the axe had simply stayed in his hand through everything, because letting go of a tool mid-work was not a thing his body understood how to do. But that wasn't the whole answer. "It's mine," he said. Ashcroft looked at him from the back of his horse, river ice eyes in the dark, and said nothing. Which meant, Gideon suspected, that Ashcroft understood exactly what he meant and had the sense not to make it into something larger than it was. They rode. The high trail climbed away from the valley floor and the flooding retreated below them, the world narrowing to the cone of what the horses could navigate, and the rain and the dark pressing against it from all sides. Gideon felt the cold working back into his bones. He'd never fully dried from the ford, and the hour of sleep had let his body fully register what it had been through. But the cold was just the cold, a condition of the road, a price being paid. He thought about what waited in Billings. He thought about a courtroom and a circuit judge and documents that looked like other documents, and he thought about standing up in that room and saying what had happened in his cabin tonight. He was not, by nature, a man who used words as weapons. He'd always understood himself as a man of the axe, of the cut, of the visible result. The idea of language as the primary instrument felt uncertain in his hands, the way a tool you hadn't trained on felt uncertain. But the third man's patient eyes came back to him, and he thought, a man who had spent 4 years building a machine out of documents and debt understood something that Gideon was only beginning to understand. The axe could keep 3 men out of his cabin tonight. It couldn't keep Caldwell's system out of his life next month, next year, the month after that. The quiet, comprehensive pressure of a mechanism that had never needed to be violent because it was patient enough to wait until violence was unnecessary. You didn't fight that with an axe. He knew what he was riding toward, and he knew what he was leaving behind, and he held both of those things at the same time the way you held a heavy cut on the ridge, steady, distributed, the weight acknowledged and accounted for, the work still going. They were 2 hours out from the cabin, climbing toward the high route in the pre-dawn dark, when Ashcroft said, "There's something I need to tell you." The way he said it, not the words but the specific weight of them, the slight reduction in pace, the particular quality of a man beginning a sentence he'd been forming for the last 2 hours, told Gideon that whatever came next was going to change the shape of something he'd already thought he understood. He said nothing. He waited. "Caldwell," Ashcroft said, "isn't working alone." The horses moved on through the dark. "The documentation I've assembled, the fraud case, the false instruments, the coerced signatures." Ashcroft's voice was level, the level of a man delivering information he'd been sitting with long enough to have made a decision about it. "When I traced the originating contracts through the Territorial Land Office, the filing agent on 3 of them, 3 of the properties Caldwell acquired through this method, signed off with a name I recognized." Gideon waited. "Warren Hutchings," Ashcroft said. The name landed in Gideon's chest like a boot on wet stone, the particular shock of a word that rearranges the landscape around it. Warren Hutchings, his foreman. The man he'd sent Danny Pratt back to inform, 2 hours ago, that Gideon Mercer had left the ridge on account of a family emergency. The man who now knew exactly what had driven him off the mountain. The man who knew exactly which road Gideon would have to take to reach Billings. He didn't say anything for 3 full seconds, feeling the new shape of things, the whole careful architecture of the last 12 hours reorganizing around this single name. And then he looked at Ashcroft in the dark and found Ashcroft already looking back at him. "How long have you known?" Gideon said. 3 days. "You didn't tell me." "I needed to know if you were part of it." The rain fell between them. The horses kept moving. Gideon thought about Warren Hutchings, the man's face, the particular way he watched the crew without appearing to, the small accommodations and oversights that had always been explicable as reasonable management and now reorganized themselves into a pattern with a different explanation. 3 years of working under a man who had been, the whole time, part of the system aimed at him. 3 years of showing up before dawn and leaving after dark while the mechanism that intended to take his land employed him, watched him, and waited. He thought about Danny Pratt riding hard through the storm, with a message that told Hutchings exactly where Gideon was going and why. He thought about the high route to Billings. "How many people know this route?" he said. Ashcroft's answer took just a half-second longer than it should have, and in that half-second, somewhere in the dark ahead of them, above the sound of the rain, above the horses' hooves on wet stone, Gideon heard a branch crack. Not the storm, not the wind, the specific, unmistakable percussion of weight on dead wood. Something large, something that had been still and had chosen, in that moment, to move. He had the horse stopped and his body turned before he'd completed the conscious thought, the axe coming up from the saddle with the same automatic authority it always had, and in the thin gray pre-dawn that was just beginning to seep through the rain and the timber, he saw them. 3 riders on the trail above, blocking the route. Motionless in the dark, the horses standing with the trained stillness of animals held by experienced hands. Not the collectors, different men. And the one in the center sitting very straight in the saddle with the patient, comfortable posture of a man who had been waiting a reasonable amount of time and expected to wait a reasonable amount more, was someone Gideon had never seen before. But he knew, with the cold precision that had been his survival mechanism for 38 years of hard country, exactly who he was. The man looked down at them from the trail above and said nothing. He didn't need to. The road to Billings was closed. The man in the center didn't move. That was the first thing Gideon processed. Not the horses, not the numbers, not the rifles that he could see now as the pre-dawn gray thickened just enough to give shape to things. The stillness, the particular quality of a man who had arranged this moment with enough care that he could afford to let it breathe, who understood that silence was its own form of pressure and had learned to apply it the way you applied a vice, gradually, without drama, until the thing inside it began to give. 3 riders above on the trail. The route to Billings blocked. Gideon didn't lower the axe. Beside him, Ashcroft had gone very still on his horse. Not the stillness of fear, but of calculation, that rapid internal architecture building that Gideon recognized because he did it himself, the mind moving fast through options while the body projected nothing. The man in the center finally spoke. Edwin? Not Mr. Ashcroft, just Edwin, with the flat familiarity of someone who had long ago decided that titles between them were unnecessary because the power differential was settled enough not to require performance. I was hoping we'd meet on the road. Ashcroft's voice came back level. Thomas Caldwell. Gideon had built a picture of this man from 2 years of debt and distance, a picture assembled entirely from effects, from the shape of what his pressure had done to a family's finances and sleep and margin for error. He'd imagined something harder, somehow, more obviously dangerous. The man on the horse in the gray dawn was perhaps 55, lean in the way of someone who had once been heavy and had shed it through some discipline or illness, with a long face and the particular pallor of someone who worked primarily indoors. He wore a good coat. His hands on the reins were very still. His eyes, when they moved from Ashcroft to Gideon, were the color of old wood, not warm, not cold, just the absence of anything not useful. Mercer, Caldwell said, you're a hard man to discourage. I've been told. That's not a compliment in my experience. He looked at Gideon with the careful, assessing attention of a man reading a document, taking in the soaked clothes, the axe, the horse he didn't own, the position on the trail, running his own calculations. You cost me a significant amount of planning tonight. Good. Something moved in Caldwell's face that wasn't quite a smile. Get off the horses. Neither of them moved. The 2 riders flanking Caldwell shifted, and Gideon heard a third sound behind them. Hooves on the trail below, cutting off the retreat. And without turning, he understood the geometry. 2 above, at least 1 below. And Caldwell in the center with the patient expression of a man who had done this before and knew how it resolved. Edwin, Caldwell said, the documents in your saddlebag. The case you've been building. He paused. I know what's in them. I've known for 3 weeks. A silence that had weight in it. Get off the horses, Caldwell said again, or I have a conversation with your wife about the Helena Land Office records from 1871 that you've been hoping nobody would find. Gideon didn't know what that meant, but he felt Ashcroft go still beside him in a way that was different from the previous stillness. Deeper, more total, the stillness of a man who has just had the floor taken from under him and is deciding, in the space of a breath, whether to fall or to find something else to stand on. Ashcroft got off the horse. Mats. They stood in the rain on the high trail, with the gray dawn pressing through the timber and Caldwell's men around them, and Gideon felt the full shape of the trap, the way you felt the shape of a room when someone took the lamp away. Not all at once, but incrementally, as the darkness resolved into walls. Caldwell had dismounted too, which was a choice, a deliberate leveling, a performance of ease that communicated he had no need for the height advantage because every other advantage was already his. He stood on the trail with his coat hanging straight in the rain and looked at Ashcroft with the expression of a man concluding a transaction that had taken longer than he'd hoped. The Helena records, Ashcroft said. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it had changed. A thinning, a compression, like wood under load before it cracks. 1871, Caldwell said. The Clearwater Grant. The survey you filed used markers from the 1869 survey that you knew had been challenged in the territorial court. He paused. That's fraud, Edwin. Not the creative kind. The kind that voids a title. That survey was settled in your favor because the challenger died before the hearing concluded. I know. I read the record very carefully. Caldwell looked at him without heat, without pleasure, just the level attention of a man reading a column of numbers. Your entire northern holding rests on that grant. Every timber contract, every lease, every deed issued since 1871. All of it sits on a foundation that I can have re-examined by a territorial court inside of 30 days. Ashcroft said nothing. Gideon looked at the man beside him. This man who had followed him through a storm, who had sat at his table and told him about a foreman lost 12 years ago, who had produced genuine legal documents and a genuine offer of help. And he felt the shape of something he hadn't accounted for in all his calculating. Not betrayal, not yet, but the specific cold discovery that the help you'd accepted had its own foundation, its own weight-bearing provisions buried in the third paragraph, where you hadn't looked. Caldwell turned to Gideon. You, he said, I have no quarrel with personally. This has always been about the land. Sign the transfer tonight. Your wife's signature, properly witnessed. And the debt disappears. Every cent. I'll have papers drawn that give you 6 months to find alternative accommodation, and I'll provide a reference for employment anywhere in the territory. Gideon looked at him. No, he said. Caldwell absorbed this without visible reaction. Mercer, no. Gideon held the man's old wood eyes with the steadiness he'd been carrying for 38 years in hard country, the steadiness that had nothing underneath it except the simple, total refusal of a man who had decided what he would and would not accept, and had no remaining interest in explaining the reasoning. You want my land? You take me to court. You take me to a judge with your papers and my papers, and you make your case in front of someone who isn't on your payroll. The roads will open. A pause. They always open. Something shifted in Caldwell's face, not anger. Anger would have been easier to read, easier to predict. Something colder. The recalculation of a patient machine encountering a variable it had underweighted. He looked at Ashcroft. The Helena records go to the territorial attorney's office Monday morning, he said, unless we conclude this tonight. Ashcroft had been standing very still through this exchange, and Gideon had been watching him from the edge of his attention the way you watched weather. Not focused on it, but aware of every change. He watched Ashcroft's hands. He watched the specific quality of the man's stillness. He watched the moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, where Ashcroft ran the full calculation and arrived at his answer. What do you need? Ashcroft said. His voice had changed, not broken, controlled, precise, but pointed in a different direction than it had been pointed 30 seconds ago. Gideon felt it before he understood it. The documents in your saddlebag, Caldwell said. All of them. And your signature on a statement withdrawing your complaint with the circuit court. And Mercer. Mercer signs the transfer, yes. A silence. Edwin, Gideon said. Ashcroft didn't look at him. Edwin. Harder. I'm sorry, Mercer. And his voice, when he said it, was the voice of a man who was genuinely sorry. Not performing sorry, not using sorry as a social lubricant, but carrying the real weight of it. The specific gravity of a man who has made a choice and knows exactly what it costs and has made it anyway. My holdings, my employees, 300 men and their families. A pause. I can't lose it over 40 acres. The rain fell. Gideon looked at this man, and the full architecture of the last 12 hours reorganized itself around this moment with the cold, comprehensive clarity of a thing that had always been true and had simply waited for the right pressure to surface. The foreman lost 12 years ago. The genuine documents. The real legal paper placed on his table with the particular precision of a man who needed Gideon to trust him enough to ride. The hour of sleep he'd been given, the good horse, the high route, all of it, every piece of it, had been true. And all of it, every piece of it, had just been set aside. Not because Ashcroft was a bad man. That would have been simpler to carry, simpler to know what to do with. Because Ashcroft was a man with 300 employees and a northern holding and an 1871 land grant, and the particular ruthless arithmetic of someone who had too much to lose and had always known, underneath everything, that the arithmetic would win when it came to it. 40 acres against 300 men. He'd lost before he started. Gideon looked at Caldwell. "You planned for him," he said. Not a question. Caldwell looked back at him without apology, which was almost a form of respect. "I planned for everything. Hutchings told you I was coming. Hutchings told me you'd left the ridge. I already knew about Ashcroft's case. I've had a man in his organization for 8 months." He paused. "Mercer, I want you to understand. This doesn't have to be painful. The offer I made is genuine. The land is what I need. You and your family." "Get away from me," Gideon said. Caldwell stopped. The words hadn't been loud. They'd been the opposite of loud. Compressed, low, carrying the specific register of a man who had arrived at the bottom of something and found it solid. Caldwell read that register and stopped speaking, which told Gideon that whatever else the man was, he was not stupid. One of the flanking riders moved his horse a step closer. "Easy," Caldwell said to the rider. Gideon hadn't moved. He was standing in the rain with the axe at his side and his boots in the mud of the high trail, and the full weight of the situation arranged around him like a room with no doors. And he was doing what he always did when the work was at its hardest. He was looking at the wood, not the distraction of the environment, not the storm or the men on horses or the magnitude of what he'd just lost. The cut, the thing directly in front of him that needed doing before anything else could happen. Ashcroft was handing the saddlebag to Caldwell's man. 6 months of documentation, the fraud case, the coerced signatures, Hennessy's quarter section and 2 other properties, and the full assembled record of 4 years of systematic theft dressed in legal language, being handed over in a saddlebag in the pre-dawn rain on a trail in the Montana hills. He watched it happen. He stored what he felt about it in the same place he stored everything that couldn't be used right now. Deep, contained, not gone, but set aside with the particular discipline of a man who had learned that feeling things at the wrong moment was just another way of losing. "The transfer document," Caldwell said, producing papers from his own coat. "Your signature, and we're done tonight." He held them out toward Gideon. Gideon looked at the papers. He thought about Clara at the table with her hands flat and her spine straight. He thought about Thomas in the corner by the wood box with his knees pulled to his chest. He thought about the tin box under the floorboard, and $3.40 and $47.30, and the compound interest of 2 years of patience and a land corridor to the Divide timber contracts that was worth more than all of it together. He thought about the third man's patient eyes. He thought about Ashcroft saying, "I needed to know if you were part of it." He thought about how you built a house on a foundation and how you built a fraud on a foundation, and how the difference between them was only visible from underneath, only visible to someone who had reason to look. "I need to think," he said. Caldwell's eyebrows moved a fraction. "There's nothing—" "I said I need to think." He looked at Caldwell steadily. "You've been patient for 2 years. You can be patient for 10 minutes. A long pause. Caldwell assessed him, running that cold, comprehensive calculation, and apparently arrived at the conclusion that a man standing in the rain, surrounded by 4 armed riders asking for 10 minutes, was not a man with an escape plan, was a man at the end of his options running up against the wall, and that 10 minutes was a reasonable price to pay for a signature given without a fight, rather than extracted from a man who had just decided he had nothing left to lose. 10 minutes, Caldwell said. Then we conclude this. Gideon walked to the edge of the trail, where the timber pressed in close and the rain dripped from the branches in irregular percussion, and he stood with his back to the men and looked into the trees. He was not, in those 10 minutes, making peace with the loss. He was not processing grief or running through regret, or doing any of the things that the situation might have seemed to call for. He was looking at the wood, the cut, the thing directly in front of him. Caldwell had planned for everything. 8 months of preparation. Hutchings and his crew, the Helena records in his back pocket, Ashcroft neutralized before Ashcroft had been deployed. 3 riders on the high trail at the exact moment they'd need to be there. He'd planned for everything except one thing, because there was one thing Caldwell hadn't been able to plan for, one variable his comprehensive machine hadn't accounted for, and Gideon had been standing next to it for the last 20 minutes, watching it get handed over in a saddlebag, and only now, standing at the edge of the trail in the rain, understood what it actually was. The Helena records. Caldwell had used them as a lever. The threat of exposure, the 1871 survey, the Clearwater Grant, the foundation of Ashcroft's northern holding, had been the mechanism that neutralized Ashcroft in 30 seconds flat. It had worked perfectly. It had worked so perfectly, so efficiently, that Caldwell had taken the saddlebag and moved on without pausing to consider what he'd just confirmed out loud on a trail in the Montana hills. He'd confirmed that the records existed. He'd confirmed that they were damaging. He'd confirmed that they were real. He'd confirmed all of this in front of a witness who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to be leveraged with. Gideon looked into the trees. He thought about the circuit judge in Billings that Ashcroft had mentioned. Not a corrupt relationship, just the long familiarity of two men who had been in the territory since before it had courts worth the name. He thought about a fraud case without documents and without Ashcroft's name attached to it, just one man's testimony. He thought about what testimony was worth without corroboration, and the answer was not much, in normal circumstances. He thought about what testimony was worth when the man you were testifying against had, that morning, on a public trail, in the presence of a witness, made a verbal threat to expose fraudulent land records in exchange for the suppression of a legal complaint. That was not testimony about a debt collector. That was testimony about extortion. And extortion, unlike property fraud, didn't require documents. It required a witness who could describe exactly what was said and by whom and under what circumstances, and a judge who understood the difference between a creditor protecting his interests and a man using criminal leverage to destroy a legal case. He'd lost the documents. He still had what he'd heard. He turned around and walked back to the group. Caldwell looked at him with the patient expression of a man expecting a signature. "I'll sign," Gideon said. Something in Caldwell eased, fractionally, controlled, but visible to someone watching for it. "On one condition," Gideon said. Caldwell's eyes flattened. "You're not in a position. The condition is this." Gideon looked at him steadily. "You put in writing right now that the signing is voluntary, that Gideon Mercer signs this transfer of his own free will, without coercion, on this date and at this location." A pause. "You put your name on that." Silence. Caldwell looked at him. "Why?" he said. "Because I want it legal," Gideon said. "I want it clean. I want there to be no question that this was done right." He held the old wood eyes without blinking. "If you've got nothing to hide, that's a 10-second addition to the document. If you don't want to add it, why would I have something to hide?" "I'm sure you don't," Gideon said. "So add it." The rain fell between them. Caldwell was looking at him with an attention that had changed quality. The calculation running faster now, reassessing, trying to find the angle in what seemed like a reasonable request from a man who had no angles left. He was looking for the trap and not finding it, which meant he was either going to dismiss it as the irrational last gesture of a desperate man, or he was going to recognize that the absence of a visible trap was not the same as the absence of a trap. He turned to his man with the saddlebag. "Add a voluntary declaration," he said. "My signature as witness." The man produced paper, produced a pen, wrote quickly, in the gray dawn light, while the rain fell on the page and Caldwell held his coat over it. Caldwell read what was written. Caldwell signed it. He handed it to Gideon along with the transfer document. Gideon looked at both pieces of paper. He looked at Caldwell's signature on the voluntary declaration, the neat, controlled signature of a man who kept records, who understood the weight of a signed name, who had spent 4 years building a machine out of documents and had just added one more document to it without fully understanding what he'd built. He signed the transfer. He handed it back. Caldwell took it. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man checking his work, thorough, careful, professional. And then he folded it and put it inside his coat and looked at Gideon with something that might, in another context, have been respect. "You're a stubborn man, Mercer." "I've been told that too." Caldwell turned to his horse. "The debt is cleared," he said, without turning back. "As agreed. I'll have the paperwork at the land office by end of week. He mounted. I'd suggest you find alternative accommodation within the month. The property will be in active development. He rode up the trail. His men followed. The sound of hooves faded into the rain and the trees and the gray morning, and then it was just Gideon and Ashcroft standing on the high trail with 2 horses and a saddlebag full of documents that had changed hands and a silence that had the specific weight of something that couldn't be undone. Ashcroft was looking at him. Gideon looked back. The Helena records, Gideon said. Ashcroft said nothing. They're real. A long pause. Yes. You built your northern holding on a fraudulent survey. I built it on a survey that was challenged and settled in my favor. Ashcroft's voice was controlled, but something underneath it had cracked and wasn't entirely closed again. The challenge died with the challenger. I didn't manufacture that. The man died of fever. But you knew the original survey markers were wrong. Silence. You knew, Gideon said. Not an accusation. He was too tired for accusation. An accusation was hot, and he was cold. Just a statement of what was true, placed between them in the rain where they could both look at it. And you built 300 men's livelihoods on top of that knowledge, and spent 12 years hoping nobody would look. Yes, Ashcroft said. The word cost him something visible. Gideon looked at the voluntary declaration in his hand, Caldwell's signature, the date, the location, the explicit record of a man using the threat of fraudulent land record exposure to coerce the suppression of a legal complaint. He looked at it for a long moment. He thought about 300 men. He thought about 40 acres. He thought about Hennessy's quarter section and 2 other families whose signatures had been extracted by the same machine on different afternoons and different storms. He thought about what justice looked like when it was built on the same foundation as the thing it was supposed to correct. He thought about his son in the corner by the woodbox. He folded the voluntary declaration carefully and put it inside his own coat. Ride back, he said to Ashcroft. Mercer. Ride back. He picked up his reins. You've done enough. He turned the horse down the trail. Behind him he heard Ashcroft say something. His name, maybe, or an apology, or something between the two that didn't have a clean category. But the rain took it, and the distance took it, and Gideon rode down through the dawn with nothing in his hands except the reins and the axe and a single piece of paper that Caldwell had signed without understanding what he was signing. He had lost his land. He had lost his documentation. He had lost the man he'd ridden out with. And somewhere in the cold, precise machinery of his thinking, the part that had looked at the wood all the way across the flooded river and kept the axe in his hand through everything, something had shifted into a configuration he hadn't used before. Not rage, not desperation. The specific, unhurried focus of a man who had been reduced to his last resource and discovered it was the only one that had ever mattered. He knew what Caldwell had said. He knew where Caldwell had said it. He knew whose name was on the paper. He was a day's ride from a circuit judge who had known Edwin Ashcroft for 20 years and had never, in that time, been given a reason to question the man who was now, this morning, riding back down a mountain trail, having handed over 6 months of evidence to the man it was evidence against. What Gideon was riding toward was not the case Ashcroft had been building. It was something smaller, sharper. A single documented act of extortion committed by a man who had made the mistake of believing that the man he was extorting had nothing left. The road to Billings was open. It had always been open. He just had to get there before Caldwell understood what he'd put his name on. He rode harder. And behind him, somewhere in the gray Montana dawn, the sound of a second horse on the trail. Not Caldwell's men, not retreating, but coming, steady and deliberate, in the same direction he was riding. He didn't look back. He already knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had run out of time for anything except what was true, that the worst part of what was coming wasn't behind him on that trail. It was waiting for him in Billings, in the land office records, in a judge's courtroom, in the specific crushing gap between what Gideon Mercer could prove and what Thomas Caldwell could afford to deny. He rode through the dawn without stopping. The rain had thinned to something between mist and intention, not enough to call weather, just enough to make everything cold and gray and slightly unreal, The way the world looks when you've been awake long enough that the distinction between what you're seeing and what you're carrying inside you starts to blur at the edges. The horse under him was Ashcroft's gray, still solid, still moving with the deep-chested steadiness of an animal that had made a professional decision about the road and was executing it without complaint. Gideon rode with both hands on the reins and the axe across the saddle, and the voluntary declaration folded inside his coat against his chest, and he didn't think about what was behind him because what was behind him was already done. He thought about the road ahead. 70 miles to Billings in ordinary conditions. The high route added distance, but avoided the flooded valley floor. He was already 15 miles up it, which meant he'd pick up the main territorial road at Cutter's Junction sometime in the late morning if the trail held. From there, hard riding, he could be in Billings by nightfall. The circuit court operated Monday through Friday. Today was Saturday. He had one day. The second horse was still behind him. He'd heard it for the last hour. Not gaining, not falling back, just present at a consistent distance with the particular cadence of an animal being ridden deliberately rather than urgently. A rider who knew where Gideon was going and had decided to cover the same ground without announcing themselves. He'd made his calculations about it and filed them and kept moving because stopping to investigate cost time he didn't have, and the rider behind him hadn't done anything yet except follow. Sometimes following was just following. Sometimes it wasn't. He kept that distinction in his peripheral attention and put his focus on the road. Cutter's Junction was a crossroads with a trading post and a livery and 4 buildings that had managed to survive long enough to qualify as permanent, sitting in a shallow valley where the high trail met the territorial road in a wide, muddy confluence of wagon tracks. It was just past 9 in the morning when Gideon came down into it, the gray horse blowing hard from the sustained pace, and he pulled up at the livery long enough to water the animal and assess what he was looking at. 3 wagons in the yard. 2 men he didn't know loading supplies. A woman at the trading post door watching him with the frank, evaluating attention of someone who had seen a lot of men ride in from the hills looking like what Gideon looked like and had developed strong opinions about which ones were worth worrying about. He dismounted and watered the horse and was retightening the cinch when he heard the second horse come down into the junction behind him. He turned. Ashcroft. The man looked worse than Gideon felt, which was some accomplishment. He'd ridden hard to close the distance, his coat darker with wet, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had been sitting with something unbearable for the last 3 hours and hadn't found a way to set it down. He pulled up at the livery rail and dismounted and stood there with his reins in his hand and looked at Gideon across the distance between them. Gideon looked back. "I'm not here to stop you," Ashcroft said. "I know. I'm here because—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, something working in his face that he was keeping controlled by force of will. "Because what I did on that trail was the worst decision I've made in 20 years, and I've made some bad ones." Gideon said nothing. "The Helena records," Ashcroft said. "The 1871 survey. You're right about what I knew." He was looking at Gideon with the direct, stripped attention of a man who has run out of management strategies and defaulted to something raw. "I built my holdings on shaky ground, and I've known it for 12 years, and I've been living with that knowledge the way you live with a bad knee, compensating for it, working around it, hoping the terrain never gets steep enough to make it matter." "It mattered this morning?" "Yes." A pause. "It mattered this morning, and I handed over 6 months of work and left you standing on a trail and rode away." He looked at the ground for a moment and then back up. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm asking you to let me try to fix it." Gideon studied him. The thing about Ashcroft, the thing he'd understood from the beginning and had temporarily lost sight of in the crisis of the high trail, was that the man was not simple. Simple men were easier. A simple man was either trustworthy or he wasn't, and you could make a clean decision and act on it without remainder. Ashcroft was the other kind, a man whose trustworthiness had a shape to it, a load-bearing capacity that had been tested this morning and had failed at a specific threshold. And the question wasn't whether he was honest or dishonest, but whether the threshold had changed. Men changed at thresholds, sometimes toward worse, sometimes toward something that had been in them all along and needed the right kind of breaking to surface. "How?" Gideon said. Ashcroft reached into his coat and produced a document. He held it out. Gideon took it. It was a sworn statement, written in Ashcroft's hand with his signature at the bottom and a notary seal from the Cutter's Junction trading post. He'd stopped on the way through, Gideon realized. He'd stopped and had it witnessed before he came to the livery. It described the events on the high trail in full, Caldwell's presence, the threat regarding the Helena records, the saddlebag exchanged, the names, the time, the location. Every particular that Gideon's own testimony would cover, corroborated by a second witness whose name was considerably more recognizable to a Billings Circuit Court than Gideon Mercer's. It also contained, in the third paragraph, a voluntary disclosure of the 1871 survey, irregularities, and a request for the Territorial Land Office to conduct a formal review of the Clearwater Grant. Gideon read it twice. He looked up at Ashcroft. "This destroys your northern holding," he said. "Probably. 300 men. I know what it means." Ashcroft's voice was steady now in a different way than it had been steady before. Not the steadiness of a man managing a situation, but the steadiness of a man who has stopped managing and started accepting. "I should have disclosed the survey problem 12 years ago. I've been paying interest on that decision ever since, and this morning it came due, and I paid it wrong." He paused. "This is paying it right, whatever it costs." Gideon stood in the muddy yard of Cutter's Junction in the thin gray morning and held two pieces of paper, his own, Caldwell's signature on a voluntary declaration, and Ashcroft's, a corroborating witness statement, and a self-reported fraud disclosure, and felt the weight of them the way you felt a tool that had been properly balanced. Not enough. Possibly not enough. Against Caldwell's resources, against his lawyers, against the considerable advantage of a man who had been playing this game for 4 years and had thought of everything. But something. Something that hadn't existed an hour ago. "Ride with me," he said. Chamtit. They made Billings as the afternoon light was going amber and flat, the kind of light that made the wooden storefronts of a territorial town look like a painting of themselves, simultaneously real and slightly false. The main street was wet from the storm's eastern edge, the wagon ruts full of standing water, a few people moving with the purposeful efficiency of those concluding the day's business before dark. Gideon had been in Billings 4 times in 3 years, always briefly, always for transactions, and he knew the geography of it the way he knew the geometry of any tool, functional rather than intimate. He knew where the courthouse was. He also knew, as he turned onto the main street, that they were not alone in having ridden toward this town today. Caldwell's men were faster than he'd calculated. There were 2 horses at the courthouse hitch rail that he recognized, the big roan belonging to the man with the document saddlebag, and a second animal he'd seen on the high trail. They'd taken the valley road, flooded or not. They'd taken it faster than should have been possible, which meant they'd pushed their animals past reasonable, which meant Caldwell had understood, on that trail, something Gideon had hoped he hadn't. He'd understood what was on the voluntary declaration. Maybe not immediately. Maybe it had taken him an hour of riding before the specific implication of what Gideon had asked for landed in his comprehensive, careful mind and rearranged itself into its real shape. But it had landed, and now his men were at the courthouse. Gideon looked at Ashcroft. Ashcroft had seen it too. His face had settled into something that had no name Gideon could reach for. Not fear, not resignation, not the recalculation of a man looking for another exit. Just the flat, clear attention of someone who had decided, somewhere on the 70-mile road, that there was only one direction left. "How well do you know Judge Harlan?" Gideon said. "Well enough. Well enough to walk through the front of that building right now." "Yes." "Then we walk through the front of that building right now." Osh. The courthouse interior was dim and smelled of wood stove and paper and the particular institutional patience of a place that processed human desperation for a living. A clerk at the front desk looked up at them with the expression of a man calculating how close to closing time this was and how much the 2 men in front of him were about to complicate his answer. "Judge Harlan," Ashcroft said. "Court's concluded for—" "I know what time it is." Ashcroft put his card on the desk. "Tell him Edwin Ashcroft is here with a time-sensitive filing and testimony related to Thomas Caldwell's land acquisitions in the Blackwater Creek corridor." The clerk looked at the card, looked at Ashcroft, looked at Gideon, who was standing with river mud on his boots, an axe in his hand, and probably looked like something the storm had assembled from available materials. The clerk picked up the card and went through a door at the back. They waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Gideon heard voices behind the door. One of them the clerk's, one of them a third voice, older, with the deliberate cadence of a man who chose each word like he was spending money. Then footsteps. The door opened. The man who came through it was perhaps 60, compact and dry, with white hair cut short, and a face that had been processing other people's crises for so long it had developed a permanent, low-level skepticism as its resting expression. He was in his shirt sleeves, court was indeed concluded for the day, and he was looking at Ashcroft with the expression of a man deciding how seriously to take an interruption. His eyes moved to Gideon and stayed there. "Edwin," he said, without looking away from Gideon. "Who is this man?" "Gideon Mercer, timber worker, Ashcroft operations, 3 years. His family holds a 40-acre parcel on the Blackwater Creek corridor that Thomas Caldwell has been attempting to acquire through fraudulent instruments." "I'm aware of Caldwell's operations in that corridor." "Then you're aware this has been coming." A pause. Judge Harlan's eyes were still on Gideon, reading him, the way all judges read witnesses, looking for the tells of a man performing distress versus a man living it. Gideon looked back with the same steady, patient attention he brought to everything that required understanding before response. Whatever the judge found in his face, it moved something. "Come through," Harlan said. They were 20 minutes into it. Gideon's account of the previous 24 hours, Ashcroft's corroborating statement, both documents on the judge's desk, when the door at the front of the courthouse opened and they heard voices in the outer office. Harlan's clerk, higher pitched than before, and then another voice, measured and flat, with a Missouri accent. The man in the black coat. Gideon stopped mid-sentence. He looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at his desk, at the documents, at the specific cumulative weight of what he'd been handed in the last 20 minutes, and his jaw set in a way that suggested he had reached some interior conclusion and was not particularly pleased with what the conclusion required of him. "Keep going," Harlan said to Gideon. I heard them. Keep going." Gideon kept going. The voices in the outer office got louder. The clerk's protest, thin, procedural, the voice of a man outmatched by money and certainty. And then the door handle moved. Harlan looked up from his desk. "That door," he said, with the particular quiet authority of a man who had been interrupted in his own courthouse before and had very specific feelings about it, "does not open unless I open it." The door handle stopped moving. Silence from the outer office. The particular silence of men recalibrating. Gideon finished his account. Harlan read both documents again, slowly, with the careful clause-by-clause attention of a man who understood that what he was reading was going to matter in ways that would outlast this afternoon. He read the voluntary declaration with Caldwell's signature twice. He read Ashcroft's statement once and looked up at Ashcroft with an expression that Gideon couldn't fully read, something between disappointment and something more complicated. "The Helena records," Harlan said to Ashcroft. "I've disclosed them in the statement." "I see that." A pause. 12 years, Edwin." "I know. We'll come back to that." Harlan set the papers down and looked at Gideon. "What you're asking for is an emergency injunction stopping the title transfer and a warrant for Caldwell's arrest on extortion charges. You understand what that means in terms of what comes next?" "I understand." "Caldwell has 3 lawyers in this territory. 2 of them are better than anyone I can appoint to your case." "I know that too." Harlan looked at him. "What makes you think this holds?" Gideon looked back at him steadily. "Because he signed it himself," he said. "Not a forged document, not a coerced signature from a woman alone in a cabin. His name, his hand, on a piece of paper that describes exactly what he did and where he did it and who was standing there when he did it." He paused. "You can argue against a debt. You can argue against a survey. You can argue against a lot of things in a courtroom with the right lawyers. You can't argue against your own signature on your own words." The judge was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. He went to his door, not the outer door, a side door that connected to chambers, and opened it and spoke briefly to someone inside. He came back to his desk. He sat down. He pulled a form from his drawer and began writing. The outer door handle moved again. This time, the door opened. Gideon was already on his feet, the axe coming up from pure reflex before the thought formed. And what came through the door was not the man in the black coat. It was Caldwell himself. He looked different here than he had on the trail. Smaller in some way, or perhaps just differently scaled. A man in the outdoors had the wilderness to absorb his size and threat, while a man in a courthouse had walls and ceilings and other men's authority pressing in from all sides. He still had the old wood eyes, still the careful stillness, but there was something beneath it now that hadn't been visible in the pre-dawn trail. Something pressurized. He saw Gideon. He saw the documents on Harlan's desk. He saw Harlan's pen still moving. The pressurized thing beneath his stillness shifted, and for exactly a second, 1 second before the control came back down, Gideon saw the full shape of what Thomas Caldwell actually was, stripped of the patience and the long-game strategy and the comprehensive planning. A man who had spent 4 years building a machine to take things from people who couldn't fight back, and who had just walked into a room where the machinery had stopped working and didn't know yet what to do with his hands. "You can't be in here," Harlan said without looking up. "Edwin," Caldwell's eyes moved to Ashcroft. "Whatever he's told you, be quiet," Harlan said, still not looking up. "The Helena records, Mr. Caldwell." Harlan set his pen down and looked up for the first time, and his face had the expression of a man who had been a judge for 23 years and had fully inhabited the authority of that position, and was not, under any circumstances, interested in performing it for someone who was attempting to manage his courtroom from the doorway. "You will be quiet, or you will be removed, and either way, this proceeding will continue without your participation. Do you understand me?" Silence. Caldwell looked at Harlan with the old wood eyes, and Gideon watched the calculation run. The full, comprehensive Caldwell calculation, weighing options and leverage, and the Helena records, and the 3 lawyers, and the 40 acres, and the divide timber contracts, and everything he'd spent 4 years building. And he watched it arrive at a conclusion, and he watched the conclusion arrive at its own limit. Caldwell looked at Gideon. "You signed the transfer," he said. His voice was controlled. "This morning, voluntarily." "I did." "That signature stands." "It does." Gideon looked at him. "And so does yours." Something crossed Caldwell's face that wasn't quite any emotion Gideon had a name for, the specific private expression of a man who has just understood, in full, the mechanism of his own trap. How the voluntary declaration had been a request that could only be denied at the cost of suspicion or accepted at the cost of evidence. How a man who planned for everything had been handed a choice between 2 forms of exposure and had chosen the one that looked like control. How patience, which had been his primary weapon for 4 years, had been turned against him in 10 minutes on a rainy trail by a man he'd considered finished. The judge finished writing. He blotted the page. He looked at the 2 men flanking Caldwell in the doorway, the man in the black coat and the second rider from the trail, with the expression of a man assessing a problem and its most efficient solution. "Mercer," Harlan said. Gideon looked at him. "The injunction stops the title transfer pending a full fraud investigation." Harlan held the document up. "Your family stays in that cabin." He set it down and picked up the second document. "The warrant for extortion charges. I'm signing it, but I want you to understand that a warrant is the beginning of a process. Caldwell's lawyers will challenge the evidence. The voluntary declaration will be argued over. The outcome is not guaranteed." "I understand." "Do you?" Harlan looked at him with the careful attention of a man who had watched a lot of people believe their case was stronger than it was. "Because what happens next is going to be harder than what happened today. Today was a man on a horse in a rainstorm. What comes next is a courtroom and depositions and lawyers who get paid to make things like that voluntary declaration disappear into procedural technicalities." "I know." Gideon held the judge's gaze. "But I spent 2 years being afraid of a debt I couldn't see the full shape of. I can see it now. All of it. A pause. I'd rather fight something I can see. Harlan held his gaze for a long moment. Then he signed the warrant. He handed it to his clerk, who had appeared from the back room with the expression of a man who had decided to be very professional about the extraordinary nature of his afternoon. Harlan looked at the two men in the doorway. "Gentlemen," he said, "you'll want to step outside." Neither of them moved. Gideon looked at Caldwell. Caldwell was looking at the warrant in the clerk's hand with an expression that had finally fully resolved itself into something readable, not the patient old wood calm, not the comprehensive calculation. Something older than both of those things, something that lived underneath the strategy and the machine and the 4 years of planning. He was looking at the end of something he'd spent a very long time building. "This isn't over," Caldwell said. "I know," Gideon said. "I have 3 lawyers. I have the Helena records. I have your signature on that transfer." "I know all of that." "Then you know you haven't won anything." Gideon looked at him steadily. He thought about Clara at the table. He thought about Thomas in the corner by the wood box. He thought about the Blackwater ford and the cold that had been past sensation and the rock he'd found with one hand in the dark under the current. He thought about the axe still in his grip when he'd come up on the far bank. "My family is in that cabin tonight," he said. "That's enough for now." Caldwell's jaw tightened. The clerk moved past him with the warrant. And in the moment before Caldwell's men stepped forward, the moment before the outer office erupted into the controlled chaos of a warrant being served on men who had not expected to be served, Gideon saw the man in the black coat's hand move toward his coat, toward the inside pocket where men who carried things they didn't want visible kept them. And he saw it with the specific, unhurried clarity of a man who had been trained by 38 years of hard country to see exactly one thing at a time and see it completely. The axe came up. Not a swing, not a threat. Just up. Present, visible, the full weight of it held in both hands with the particular authority of a tool that knew its purpose and had been through enough to have no doubts about it. The man in the black coat went still. The room went still. Harlan was already on his feet. And from outside, from the street, from the direction of the livery where 2 horses had been standing for the last hour, came the sound of boots on the boardwalk, more than 2 pairs, moving with purpose. And Gideon understood that someone had sent for the county sheriff at some point in the last half hour, and the county sheriff had arrived, and the geometry of the room was about to change, in a direction that couldn't be predicted from any position Caldwell had planned for. The outer door opened. 3 men came in with badges. Caldwell looked at them. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the warrant. He looked at Edwin Ashcroft, standing at the back of the room with his corroborating statement on the judge's desk, and the Helena disclosure alongside it, and the expression of a man who had spent 12 years compensating for a bad foundation and had finally, this afternoon, decided to stop. And Gideon watched the comprehensive, patient 4-year machine that was Thomas Caldwell's plan for the Blackwater Creek corridor encounter, something it had not modeled, had not weighted, had not accounted for in any of its architecture. A man with nothing left who had found, in the having of nothing, that he was capable of something the machine couldn't measure. "Mr. Caldwell," the sheriff said. Caldwell said nothing. The sheriff looked at the warrant. He looked at Caldwell. He reached for his handcuffs. And in the half-second before the metal touched Caldwell's wrists, in the suspended, breathless instant when the afternoon hung between what it had been and what it was about to become, Gideon saw Caldwell's eyes move one last time to the man in the black coat, and something passed between them, wordless and fast. The specific communication of men who had a contingency they had not yet played. The black-coated man moved, not toward Gideon, not toward Harlan, toward Ashcroft, toward the corroborating statement on the judge's desk, toward the only witness whose removal made the extortion charge a single man's word against a well-lawyered landowner's. The man in the black coat crossed the room in 3 strides. Gideon was already moving, not toward the man, toward the desk. The specific, single-minded geometry of someone who had identified the one thing in the room that mattered and was moving to stand between it and the thing coming for it, the same geometry he'd used crossing the Blackwater ford, the same geometry he'd used every morning on the ridge. Find the cut, put your body at the axe, let everything else resolve around that fixed point. He got there first. His hip hit the edge of the judge's desk, and he put both hands flat on the documents, Ashcroft's statement, the voluntary declaration, both of them under his palms, and turned to face the man in the black coat with the axe held horizontal across his body. Not raised, not threatening, just present, just there. The way a closed door is present, the way a wall is present, communicating through mass and position rather than violence. The man in the black coat stopped. He was 3 feet away, close enough that Gideon could see the specific quality of his hesitation. Not fear, but the rapid calculation of a man whose orders had encountered an obstacle that changed the math. He'd been sent to retrieve documents. He had not been briefed, apparently, on what to do when the documents were under the hands of a man who had already crossed a flooded river today and still looked like he had capacity for more. The sheriff moved. 2 of his men were already at Caldwell, hands on arms, the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before, not roughly, not brutally, just the irresistible administrative grip of authority applied to a body that had run out of room to maneuver. The 3rd deputy came up behind the man in the black coat and said very quietly, "Step back." The man stepped back. Caldwell had gone still in the sheriff's deputy's grip, with the particular stillness of a man preserving whatever dignity remained when the geometry of a room has finally and completely resolved against him. He was looking at Gideon across the desk, across the documents under Gideon's hands, across the axe, across the full length of what the last 24 hours had been. And his old wood eyes had something in them now that hadn't been there before. Not defeat. Something more interior than defeat. The specific recognition of a man who built machines and was looking at the piece the machine hadn't accounted for. "It was the declaration," Caldwell said. Not to the sheriff. Not to Harlan. To Gideon. "Yes," Gideon said. "You asked for it knowing I'd sign it. I asked for it knowing you couldn't refuse it without admitting you had something to hide." A long pause. Something moved behind Caldwell's eyes. The final running of a calculation that had nowhere left to go. And then, with the careful, compressed dignity of a man who had spent 4 years being patient and was applying that same patience now to its own ending, he said nothing more. The sheriff let him out. The man in the black coat went next, and then the second rider from the trail, and then the outer door closed, and the courthouse went quiet in the particular way of a room that has been holding a great deal of pressure and has just been relieved of it. Not peaceful, not yet, but decompressing, the silence of aftermath. Gideon lifted his hands from the documents. He looked at them, at the papers on the desk, at the judge's signature on the injunction, at Ashcroft's handwriting in the sworn statement, and felt the full weight of the day in his hands the way you felt a day's timber work in your hands at the end of it. Not pain, exactly, just the honest accounting of what had been spent. He sat down in the nearest chair. It was the first time he'd sat down since the cabin. Harlan gave them 20 minutes before he came back into the room. He brought coffee, which Gideon did not expect from a circuit court judge, and which told him something about the man that the last 2 hours had already been suggesting. He set the cups on the desk and sat across from them and looked at both men with the measured, careful attention of someone who had been processing other people's worst days for 23 years and had not, in all that time, stopped taking them seriously. "The injunction holds," he said. "The title transfer is suspended pending investigation. Your family stays on the property." He looked at Gideon. "That's tonight and for the foreseeable." "What about the transfer I signed?" "Signed under circumstances I'm prepared to characterize as coercive, given what's now on record." Harlan picked up the voluntary declaration and looked at it with the careful attention he'd been giving it since Gideon first put it on his desk. This document is going to be the center of a very interesting legal argument. Caldwell's lawyers will contend that a voluntary declaration witnessed by the parties in interest has no standing as evidence of extortion. And your contention? My contention is that a man who produces a document, signs it, and presents it as evidence of his own good faith has made a statement about the circumstances under which it was produced, and that statement is admissible. He set it down. "I've been wrong before, but I don't think I'm wrong about this one." Ashcroft had been sitting at the far end of the desk through this exchange with his coffee untouched and his hands folded on the table in front of him, and Gideon had been watching him from the edge of his attention the way he'd been watching him since the high trail. Not suspicion anymore, just the steady, honest attention of a man trying to understand what he was actually looking at. What he was looking at, he had decided somewhere on the 70-mile road, was a complicated man. Not a good man in the simple, clean sense. Not a bad man in the simple, clean sense. A man who had built something large on a shaky foundation and spent 12 years being afraid of that foundation and had, in the space of one morning, been afraid of it and then decided to stop being afraid of it and had paid the price of that decision with open eyes. Gideon understood that. Not comfortably. There was nothing comfortable about understanding it, but truly. The way you understood terrain that had cost you something to cross. "Edwin?" Harlan said. Ashcroft looked up. "The Helena disclosure. What you've put in that statement." Harlan's voice had shifted. Still the judge's voice, still measured, but something underneath it that was older and more personal. "You understand this goes to the Territorial Land Office Monday morning. I wrote it. 300 employees. I know. Your Northern holding, the Clearwater title, every lease and contract built on it. The review process takes 6 to 18 months and the outcome is not—" "I know, Malcolm. First names now, the long familiarity surfacing through the professional form. I've known what it would cost for 12 years. He stopped. His hands unfolded on the table and then folded again, a small, unguarded gesture that Gideon had not seen from him before. I kept thinking there would be a better moment, a moment when the cost would be less. And there never was, and it kept compounding, the way these things do, until it came due this morning in a way I couldn't—" He stopped again. "I handled it wrong this morning." "You handled it right afterward," Gideon said. Ashcroft looked at him. "You handled it wrong, and then you handled it right," Gideon said. "Most men don't get to the second part." The room held that for a moment. Harlan looked at Gideon with the expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of something, an expression Gideon had been receiving from people for the last 24 hours and was not entirely sure what to do with. He looked back at the judge steadily and waited. "Go home, Mercer," Harlan said. "Your family is waiting." Chat. He left Billings as the last of the day's light was going out of the sky, the amber gone to gray, gone to the deep, specific blue of a clear night coming in behind the storm. The road back was dry. The storm had pushed east, the valley floor passable, the 70 miles collapsible to something reasonable on a rested horse. Ashcroft had arranged the horse and provision at the livery without being asked. The gray topped up and rested, a saddlebag with enough for the road. He'd stood at the livery door while Gideon mounted. "The fraud case," Ashcroft said. "What I was building. The documentation Caldwell took on the trail. My men know what was in it. We can reconstruct most of it. You'd still pursue it. Caldwell has done this to 6 families that I know of, probably more." Ashcroft looked at him with the river ice eyes, clearer now than they'd been all day, something cleaned out of them by the afternoon's events. "The Helena disclosure isn't going to leave me in a position to lead that effort, but the effort should be led." Gideon looked at him from the saddle. "I'm a timber worker," he said. "You're the man who walked into a judge's chambers with a piece of paper and an axe and made a case that should not have been makeable." Ashcroft paused. "What you do with that is your business. But the case exists. The record exists. The warrant exists." Another pause. "And Hennessy still doesn't own his quarter section." Gideon thought about Hennessy. He thought about 2 other families whose signatures had been taken on rainy afternoons while their husbands worked the high ground. He thought about a system that operated in the gaps, in the distance between a man and his family, in the width of a flooded river, in the fine print of a document designed to be unread. He thought about what it meant to know the shape of a thing. "I'll think about it," he said. He rode. The cabin was lit from inside when he came through the tree line. Lamplight in both windows, smoke from the chimney, the horses in the lean-to well clear of the mud. He pulled up at the hitch post and sat for a moment in the dark before dismounting, looking at it, at this 40 acres and the structure he'd built on it with his own hands over 3 years of early mornings and late evenings and weekends when he should have been resting, and felt what it meant to have nearly lost it in a way that was different from how he'd felt about it before. Not more grateful, exactly. more clear. The way pain clarifies a thing it has threatened, strips it of the accumulation of habit and assumption, and reveals what was underneath all along. He had built this. On honest ground, with honest hands. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the only thing he'd been trying to protect all along. And understanding it, this clearly felt like arriving somewhere he'd been moving toward without knowing the destination. He dismounted and tied the horse and went up the steps. The door opened before he reached it. Clara stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind her, and she looked at him, at the mud and the river residue and the 2 days of exhaustion arranged across his face, and did not ask any of the questions that were visibly present in her eyes, because Clara had always understood that some accounting waited for its proper moment, that the immediate return of a man was not the moment for tallying what the journey had cost. She just looked at him. He looked back at her. "It holds," he said. "The land holds." She closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, brief and total, and then opened them and stepped back to let him in. Thomas was asleep in the bed. He'd moved from the chair at some point in the evening and curled under the blanket with one arm out and his face pressed into the pillow with the profound unconsciousness of a child who had been frightened and was now safe and had communicated that safety to every muscle in his body simultaneously. Gideon stood at the bedside and looked at his son for a long moment. He thought about what it meant, this sleeping child, this specific configuration of trust and vulnerability, to have someone in the world whose safety you had organized your entire life around. Not as a burden, not as a weight, as the thing that made the weight worth carrying, the specific gravity that gave direction to every other force. He thought about a man in Helena sitting in an office looking at ledgers while the world outside went wrong. He thought about 12 years of compound interest on a decision made in a moment of fear. He would not pay that debt, not in that currency, not on that timeline. Whatever came next, the fraud case, Hennessy's land, the 6 families, the system that operated in the gaps, whatever came next would come next. Tonight was tonight. He pulled the blanket up over Thomas's arm and went to sit at the table. Clara made food, real food, the kind that required time and attention, that communicated through its own existence that the emergency was over and the ordinary world had permission to return. She moved through the small space of the cabin with the economical grace he'd been watching for 6 years and still couldn't entirely account for. And she didn't ask him to talk until she sat down across from him and the food was between them and the lamp was low. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it. The High Trail and Caldwell and the Declaration and Ashcroft's choice and his own choice and Harlan's chambers and the warrant and the black-coated man moving across the courtroom and the geometry that had resolved, finally, in the direction it needed to resolve. He told it the way he told her everything, plainly, without ornament, the facts in the order they'd happened. And she listened the way she always listened, with her full attention and none of the performance of listening, no nodding, no reactive expressions, just the real thing. When he finished, the food was gone and the lamp was lower and the night outside was full and quiet. "Ashcroft," Clara said. "Yes, you trust him." Gideon thought about it honestly. "I trust what he did this afternoon. I trust what it cost him." He paused. "That's not the same as trust, maybe, but it's closer than where I started." Clara looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether a thing was true. She held it for a moment. "The other families," she said. "Yes. That's what's next." It wasn't a question, which meant she'd already understood it from the telling, had already assembled the architecture of what came next from the pieces he'd laid out, which was one of the things about Clara that he had never stopped finding astonishing. The speed of her, the comprehensive accuracy of her understanding when she turned it fully on something. "It's what's next," he said. She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was doing what lamplight did in the low hours of evening, softening the careful composure she maintained all day, letting the real face through, the one that didn't need to perform competence or endurance or the 1,000 other things a woman in her position had to perform daily just to maintain the ground she stood on. "You're different," she said. "Am I?" "You came in that door last night and you were the same. Running toward something the same way you always run toward things." She paused, choosing words with the care she always chose them when she was saying something that mattered. You came in this door tonight, and you're still. He thought about that. He thought about the Blackwater Ford and the cold that was past sensation, and the rock he'd found with one hand in the dark, and the getting up on the far bank. He thought about the axe still in his grip. He thought about 10 minutes at the edge of a trail, looking into timber, and understanding that the only resource he had left was the one that couldn't be taken, couldn't be documented, couldn't be filed in a land office or forfeited in a courtroom. The plain, specific, unremarkable knowledge of what he had seen and heard and what it meant. He thought about what it cost a man to be stripped down to that, to lose the documents and the ally and the road and the plan and arrive at the courthouse with nothing except one piece of paper and the truth of what he'd witnessed, and what it built in a man, being stripped to that. Not confidence in the loud performed sense, not the certainty of a man who had won, something quieter, the specific, settled quality of a man who had found out what was under the fear and found it solid, not invulnerable, not free from what was still coming, the lawyers, the process, the 6 months of legal difficulty that Harlan had been careful to outline honestly. None of that was over, but known, the shape of it known, the floor of it found. I found out what I'm made of, he said. That's all. Clara looked at him. I know what you're made of, she said. I've known for 6 years. I didn't. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quietness he understood that this was something she had been waiting in her patient, clear-eyed way for him to arrive at. Not something she could have told him, not something that transferred through words or reassurance or even the years of her own demonstrated faith in him. The thing that could only be known by going through the water that was past sensation and finding the rock and getting up on the far bank with the axe still in your hand. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Neither of them said anything for a while. The fire settled. Outside, the night was clear and cold with the particular clarity that comes after a storm has moved through and taken the debris of weather with it, leaving the air stripped and honest and smelling of pine and wet earth, and the specific cleanness of a sky that has spent itself completely. Gideon sat at his own table in his own cabin on his own land and felt the silence. The way you felt the end of a long day's work, not as absence but as presence, as the arrived-at thing, the place the whole day had been moving toward without knowing it. He thought about Caldwell in the sheriff's custody and the lawyers that would come and the months of process ahead. He thought about Hennessy and his quarter section and the other names on other documents. He thought about Ashcroft's sworn statement and the Helena disclosure and 300 men whose livelihoods were built on shaky ground and what it would take to stabilize that ground honestly rather than leaving it to compound further in the dark. He thought about a foreman 12 years gone. He thought about what it meant to see something happening on your own land and not look away from it. He would ride to Hennessy in the morning. He would tell the man what he knew and what was possible and what it would require. He would do the same for the other families, one by one, with the same plainness and the same patience, because that was what the work called for. And he had learned, in the last 24 hours, that the work was never just the work you were pointed at. It was everything the work revealed when you followed it all the way to its actual end. Not because he was a different man than he'd been yesterday morning on the ridge, because he was exactly the same man, and he finally knew what that meant. Thomas stirred in the bed, some small adjustment of a sleeping child, a murmur, and then the deep return to silence. Both of them looked toward the sound, the automatic bodily attention of parents, and then looked back at each other. And the look between them carried everything that the day had been. The fear and the running and the river and the room in Billings and the warrant and the quiet courthouse afterward carried all of it and held it without needing to speak it, because some things between people who have been through enough together live below the level of language, in the place where what you've survived together becomes the ground you stand on. He turned his hand over under hers. She held it. Outside, Montana was doing what it always did after a storm, reassembling itself in the dark, the creeks dropping, the roads firming, the timber standing in the cold, clear air with the patient, enormous permanence of things that have been through weather before and will be through it again and are not, in any essential way, diminished by the passage of it. The lamp burned low. The fire held. Gideon Mercer sat at his table and let the stillness be what it was. Not the stillness of a man who had finished, but the stillness of a man who had found his footing, who understood now that the ground was always going to move under you, that Caldwell was one shape the moving ground took and would not be the last, that the question was never whether the floor would hold, but whether you knew how to find it in the dark with one hand. He knew. He had always known. He just hadn't needed to know it completely until yesterday. He looked at his wife's hand over his. He looked at the sleeping shape of his son in the firelight. He looked at the door he'd built and the walls he'd fitted and the life assembled piece by piece on 40 acres of honest Montana ground. He thought, this is enough. And then, this is the beginning. And the night held both of those things at once, the way nights in hard country always did. The completion and the continuation, the end of one run and the first step of the next, the particular, irreducible truth of a life that asks nothing of you except that you show up and do the work and know, when the water is past sensation and the rock is somewhere in the dark below your hand, that you are the kind of man who looks for the rock. The lamp guttered. Clara reached out and turned it down. They sat in the dark that wasn't dark, the firelight making everything in the cabin amber and warm and real, and outside the stars came out over Montana the way they always came out after a storm, all at once and completely, as if they had been waiting for exactly this.